Welcome to the Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth Kushel.
Okay, so when one of the things I've noticed we talked about this yesterday. I think this is pretty important. In the aftermath of this embassy, of this Jerusalem announcement, in the aftermath of a lot of these more hardline, openly right-wing Zionist elements becoming, I'd say, more and more prominent, more and more vocal since the inauguration of Donald Trump. I think it appears to me that at some level there's I think within this hardline element that pushes for all these hardline policies, whether it has to do with the adamance on making Jerusalem the capital of Israel and making the whole world recognize this, or the whether it's settlement policy or whether it's this hardline hawkish stance on Iran and its weapons or whatnot, that I get the impression that there's an element within this coalition of hardliners, the Kudniks in Israel, American right wing that we've talked about, that goes within much of what asks for the alternative media here in the West, as well as elements of mainstream media. When you look at people within, say, Fox News, for example, that there's almost within this network here, and I think we're seeing this with this effort, this Steve Bannon Breitbart effort to push these real hardcore conservatives, both socially as well as with domestic issues, as well as issues related to foreign policy, particularly related to Israel and the war on terror and issues related to terrorism and Islam. That I think there's almost like this reckless carelessness when it comes to perhaps just completely alienating what you'd call the so-called liberal establishment, not just in America, I think, but globally. And I think we're seeing this in the aftermath of the Jerusalem announcement. None of these European countries are willing to go along with this. You've got very globally, the response has just been extremely hostile, I'd say, to this announcement by Trump, and Netanyahu doubling down and asserting that all countries need to recognize this decision and make a decision to eventually move their embassies. I think we're seeing, we've talked about this before, but I think it's coming into full circle where there is clearly a split between the globally involving these various power structures. But I think that we're seeing that there's this element that is just so adamant about achieving its goals that it doesn't care if it completely alienates the liberal establishment and these what has created what we call this special relationship between not just the U.S. and Israel, but I'd say pretty much the entire Western establishment in Israel and in the Jewish state. And it's to the point now where we're seeing these hardliners get elected or getting pushed for Senate bids in the U.S., which could explain why somebody like a Sheldon Adelson publicly breaks with Steve Bannon's efforts to bring in these hardline conservatives into Congress. Is perhaps somebody like an Adelson is uncomfortable, sees the writing on the wall that we need the liberal establishment to support Israel and to keep this bipartisan support of Israel, but that this other element, this hardline element, just does not care that we alienate the liberal establishment and make Israel, just like everything else, a partisan issue, which it always has been in some ways, but not at this extreme level. So, Jeremy, what are you seeing here with this alienation effort that very well could be going on, where the long-term bipartisan, decades-long bipartisan support for Israel and the special relationship, where do you see this going possibly?
It is the case that a lot has been made, and there's tons of evidence that of almost any issue that you can think of in certain ways, maybe other than things like the perpetual increasing of the U.S. military budget, much of it pushed into pork barrel politics. The issue of Israel and a certain so-called support for Israel has been very much of a bipartisan consensus. And figures such as Sheldon Adelson in relationship to someone like Chaim Saban are indicative of that. They are in many ways seen as some of the leading funders Adelson for the Republicans, Saban for the Democrats, and Saban has vocally made it clear that he is a one-issue man, and that issue is Israel. And so this is a decades-long established state of affairs in American politics, is that a certain unabashed support that Israel can do no wrong, and meanwhile we'll fight over every other domestic political thing and be very divided about it, is a part of American politics. And there's a deeper history, of course, in terms of how that came into being. There's interesting history that shows that the 67 war was a key turning point in terms of the solidifying of the relationship of the U.S. and Israel, and there was a lot of factors in that. But more recently, that relationship had been unabashed. And that was something that a lot of the Israeli partisans in the American political landscape were always harping on and seemed to guard very, very carefully in a way. And with the increasing rise and concentration of Netanyahu's power in Israel, there's been showing certain fissures that play themselves out, especially in domestic partisan politics, left-right politics, and it's very much seen in Jewish politics, specifically with the Jewish liberal set in the United States of America, that increasingly sees someone like Netanyahu as basically some type of combination of the Dick Cheney in Israel, who's willing to cooperate with the sort of what they see as sort of hardline religious nuts or supremacists and that type of thing, and what they see as their misogyny, their racism, their sort of values that are antithetical to the accepted progressive Jewish American tradition in a way. So those splits have been apparent before Trump came along, but it's been very much pronounced in the rise of Trump and those that surround him. Despite the fact that in the weeks past, as the Flynn indictment came in, and in the wake of Flynn admitting his guilt to the single count, that at the Saban Forum at the Brookings Institute a couple weeks ago, Haim Saban and Jared Kushner had an intimate conversation of sorts, where Saban very much thanked and supported Kushner's move to basically try to undermine the then sitting American administration of Barack Obama in their last weeks. And that sort of began to show too that, okay, yes, clearly Saban was a Hillary Clinton supporter, he's a Democrat, but if he in his one issue, aka Israel, could be his desires could be met by this current Trump administration and his agent in the affair, Jared Kushner, who of course comes from a more of a Democrat background, involved in both the Silicon Valley set, but also the New Jersey, New York, sort of more liberal Jewish elite set in many ways, that Haim Saban was willing to expose the potential, potential criminality, pretty much, but definitely against the idea of meddling in American affairs by agents on behalf of foreign governments, especially during an era of the hyping of the Russiagate, and did Russia involve themselves in producing hacker farms or bot farms or buying Facebook ads and this types of thing, whereas this is a very, very specific singular act by a non-governmental agent at the time, Kushner, not yet seated in a position, the actual government against the then sitting government. And so this does open up questions about which way is the hardline Israel lobby moving, and are they moving in a direction where they are not worried in some way about leaving the support of Jewish American liberals or progressives behind, maybe even in general, the sort of like liberals to progressives in America behind in relationship to this sort of audacious move of the recognition of Jerusalem, especially in relationship to the rest of the world. At the same time, you see that although there were those such as the man in the Atlanta, is it the Atlanta Constitution newspaper?
I'm not sure. I think this guy was I know you're talking about Andrew Adler. He was I'm not sure exactly. He published, I think, a specifically Jewish newspaper in Atlanta, and he was a pretty prominent Jewish citizen in Atlanta. So
Yes. So he ultimately, the Atlanta Jewish Times publisher, actually, I guess, that Israel should consider assassinating Obama. In American press, that is just outrageous in a way. And that would, if one were just looking at that data point, one would think that Obama was teamed up with Hezbollah, and Obama had actually trained with Hezbollah instead of going.
well, you'll actually hear that in some circles.
Yeah, so yeah, while Obama was either in his time off or when he wasn't showing up to classes at Columbia, he wasn't working with Brzezinski in relationship to being a long-term CIA agent from a long-term CIA family. No, he was actually an agent of Hezbollah and Iran, and just a sleeper cell to destroy Israel at some level. But meanwhile, you actually go look at the facts on the ground, and this interesting article that just came out that you pointed me to, titled "Why Israel Should Be Worried About Getting Into Bed with Trump in Foreign Policy" by Derek Chollet, I believe it is, and the underline on is, "There's long been a bipartisan consensus on support for Israel that may soon be history." And underneath this, it's very interesting. First of all, they ask the question, could Trump be the wrecking ball that destroys bipartisan support for Israel? And Trump as the wrecking ball is an interesting analysis. You could sort of see it. There are those theories that say that Trump, in the midst of playing 4D chess, some of which we'll talk about later, but in the midst of playing 4D chess, Trump used this announcement in a way to call the question, or to make the choice very stark, or to expose the Israelis, or to isolate the hardliners in a certain way from the rest of the world. Okay, that's an interesting possibility. There's a little bit of faith-based politics in the midst of that. I'm definitely more open to considering that in relationship, not in relationship to Trump as a singular figure, but maybe in relationship to other forces that are in the works. Clearly, there have been some forces that were ousting the hardest liners on Iran, whether it was Flynn or his group, or Bannon or Ezra Cohen-Watnick, these types of people. Those people are out. So, all right, there is some evidence that there are some moves to be made that are pushing aside or pushing back against some of the hardliners that seem to represent a certain Israeli foreign policy. At the same time, the facts on the ground around, was actually Obama some type of anti-Israel president, are key to understand here, even in taking into consideration the Trump as a positive wrecking ball, let's say, theory here. And of course, there's also Trump as the negative wrecking ball theory that might go something like, Trump has now basically exposed beyond the wildness of legitimizing by the most powerful country in the world a long-term religio-ethnocentric, if not supremacist, occupation that's involved also in some type of ethnic cleansing operation of some sort, that of having claimed territory in the midst of war, and then basically violated Geneva Conventions in relationship to population transfers, in relationship to military occupation. What that does not only to the rule of law. Of course, the hard-headed Trump supporters are like, they don't talk about rule of law, they talk about law and order, which in many ways is a violation or a contradiction of rule of law. In many ways, it means that it's about authoritarianism, that might makes right in many ways, and that the biggest crime is not to violate the law, but to violate the order, maybe even the New World Order or the Old World Order. But so there is that aspect too, that the negative Trump wrecking ball thesis might be explained that in a certain way, Trump has actually delegitimized the United States as a player in not only in the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations long term, but also in terms of the region, which would then imply an opening to other certain powers that obviously are interested, that are also being accused of being very sympathetic to the Trump administration, namely Russia. So there's that. But then delving deeper into this foreign policy article about why Israel should be worried about getting into bed with Trump, I'm just going to read from it a little. The one paragraph, a little bit longer down there. But below the drama at the highest levels, it was also a moment of unprecedented cooperation, especially in military and intelligence affairs. The list of accomplishments was impressive: cooperating on Iron Dome, providing Israel with the best weapons, including the F-35 fighter aircraft, forging the 2016 agreement for Washington to provide $38 billion in security assistance over the next decade, which was the largest single pledge of American military assistance ever. Even the infamous, quote, red line, unquote, outcome, which most decry as Obama's most glaring failure, left Israel safer. The security of Syria's chemical weapons stockpile was an existential threat to Israel, for which it had no military answer. Recall that in the months before Syria's chemical weapons were removed, every Israeli citizen was given gas masks and antidotes in case of attack. Thank goodness they were never needed. So this is pretty interesting, and I think there's a side issue here to again consider in terms of what Obama's real relationship was with Israel, that also makes implications about Russia's real relationship with Israel. And in the past, we've pointed out that the clean break doctrine, the clean break paper written by the Richard Pearls, the Doug Feiths, the Wormsers, Charles Fairbanks, these types of folks for Netanyahu in '96 called very specifically for overthrowing the Iraqi government. That since happened based on trumped up fraudulent intelligence that was cooked up in a similar group that we talked about last show, that includes people like Michael Ledeen, who of course is tied into Flynn and the Office of Special Plans, that ties very directly into Israeli intelligence. That there was that crew involved in that. But then the other thing that it says is that Syria is to be rolled back. Syrian influence is to be rolled back. So there's a clear distinction, and it is amazing how few of the different people who are interested in this matter, whether it's the sort of the sort of 9/11 truth people like Ryan Dawson maybe, or whether it's the sort of left progressives, people like Max Blumenthal, people like that, they seem to miss this very fine but clear distinction between what's called for in the clean break doctrine between overthrowing Iraq and rolling back Syria. So that is very important to understand, because in thinking about what Obama actually did for Israel in a certain way, was Obama and then Russia, in the wake of the Ghouta false flag in 2014, helped roll back the Syrian weapons programs, and which was largely a deterrent. And what could meet the definition of rolling back Syria more clearly than removing the deterrent that Syria had, the military deterrent that Syria had, that Israel took most seriously. And of course, Obama did the exact same thing in relationship to Iran. But that then shows the actual fraud of this hardline Israeli position, that it is not really a national security position in terms of military defense. In many ways, it's a political security decision that was made. And in a certain way, you could say that Obama, in a similar fashion, called the question on Iran and showed that these hardline Israeli partisans were not being actually honest about their intentions or about their fear of the Iranian nuclear weapon, but in many ways were using that issue as, in many ways, a fraudulent, as shown by large aspects of the the international investigating community, nuclear investigation community, but also the American intelligence community at multiple times in the last decade, to be a fraud, that Iran really was a nuclear threat. And of course, this idea of, as I pointed out to then Representative Pompeo on C-SPAN a couple years ago, before he was Trump's CIA director, that I, as a Jewish American, could see that these Israeli partisans in the largely Zionist-controlled American media were basically saying every 6 months they were saying that Iran is close to a nuclear weapon. So in a way, you could say that Obama actually called the Israel's real Iran question by taking military action off the table by doing the Iran deal. And then, of course, the originating reason that Trump gave himself, and many of the people that deeply supported Trump gave for themselves, was the Iran deal. That was the big problem. It wasn't the problem of NAFTA or NATO or economic infrastructure or taxes. It was the Iran deal. So I just wanted to point that out, that not only is it the case that Obama is clearly not anti-Israel, or was not definitely not some type of agent of the Muslim Brotherhood or of Hezbollah seeking the destruction of Israel, but in many ways he actually did more for what he probably saw as Israeli actual security, military security, than many previous presidents had. And he was thanked by Adler, by being threatened for assassination by Mossad, and Netanyahu hijacking the American Congress and getting dozens of standing ovations. And then for the sort of sealing gift of it all, having Kushner, basically an agent of Israel in many ways, and also a long-term inhabitant of the Zionist mob surrounding the New Jersey, New York complex that surrounds September 11th, trying to insert himself and undermine the last little meager type of representation of Obama, saying Israel can't entirely run U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, excellent breakdown there. I'm particularly glad you broke into the Obama administration's role in that article that was published there in protecting Israel. The way I see it, and I'll try to explain this real quick, what I see is that there is, you've got this, I think, the standard establishment type of foreign policy consensus that we've talked about is very much dedicated to protecting Israel's quote unquote security. And these issues related to Syria that you just broke down, and the Iron Dome and the $38 billion deal that was made for aid to Israel, that's just standard fare. It's just protecting Israel's Israel's security, and that's kind of where I think the bipartisan consensus has always fallen with the U.S. and the U.S.-Israeli relationship is that both, the U.S. establishment is dedicated to defending Israel's security and protecting Israel. But I think where there's a split is where you've got this more hardline, in some cases, apocalyptic, messianic, religious fundamentalist mentality within both the U.S. and Israel. And we see this with not only with Jewish, more fanatical Jews, but also with the hardline Zionist Christians here in the West, and this belief that, just simply protecting Israel is not good enough. Israel's got to be able, we've got to have these hardline policies. Israel should be able to build as many settlements as it wants. The whole world has to recognize that Jerusalem symbolizes the Jewish state and it's the capital, and consequences be damned. Or we have to destroy this, we have to take action against Iran, that simply containing its nuclear program is, or whatever is going on in Iran is not good enough. We've got to have the options on the table if we need it, and the global community joining together to simply contain Iran, it's not good enough. And I think with this, there's a natural correlation between these hardline Zionists and these this right-wing, what we've seen, this quote-unquote populist movement that's risen up in the West in recent years, where they're much more friendly to these hardline Zionist policies that relate to, in some ways, perhaps a more racist, more bigoted view of the Palestinians and of the other inhabitants, non-Jewish inhabitants of Israel. And it fits in with this effort to take back these Western European countries and take back our culture and civilization here in the West. They see these people as much more natural allies than these liberals who are all about human rights and multiculturalism and these values, these human values, these global values that are said to bring people together. So I think this is a much more natural alliance. And I think someone like Netanyahu, perhaps for his own political fortunes, is willing at some level to make sort of a deal with the devil and join up with these hardline right-wingers here in the West. And that's where I think a lot of the major elements of the split that we're seeing is going on. And I think that someone like Obama or Hillary Clinton or any other type of establishment politician type that we see here in the West that is just simply willing to protect Israel's security and do all this and that, that's not good enough for these people. So they join forces with the types who will just pretty much allow Israel to do whatever it wants in the world and will not try to contain Israel's more hardline policies. I think that's what we're seeing. And I think one of the major players to take into consideration with this cultural shift and this willingness of these hardliners to align with these Western conservative types is someone like Erik Prince, for example. And we try to tie this together here as sensible as possible, but we just stumbled upon an article.
I just want to make one last point, though, in relationship specifically in terms of this potential cleaving off of a large portion of American political society, and definitely of Jewish American political society, in relationship to this hardline move that's been backed up by Trump. And that's specifically from the perspective of this aspect of the Israeli foreign policy consensus or groups, which very, very much ties back into the issue that we've been discussing for the last year about what is going on in relationship to the relationship of Israel and Russia, specifically in relationship to Israel's relationship to the United States. And so I'm quickly taken back to this very important article by Jeffrey Blankford about the Putin-Netanyahu bromance, that, of course, the opening quote from that, again, is, quote, "I know what America is. America is a thing that can be easily moved in the right direction. They will not bother us. Let's suppose that they will say something. So they say it. 80% of the Americans support us. We have such support there." That's Netanyahu being quoted talking to a group of Jewish settlers in Ofra in occupied Palestine in 2001, translated from Hebrew but not disclosed to the English-speaking world too many years later. But this also then speaks to what we're now a decade and a half after that. and things are changing in a certain way. And this really deep relationship between the hard right and Israel, that in many ways has been sort of accentuated and solidified by the population transfer post-Soviet Union from Russia into Israel, and the politics of those populations, and very much openly exposed by this long-term relationship between Avigdor Lieberman, far-right, I believe, foreign secretary, and Putin, who talk a lot, who come to lots of agreements, and there is definitely a very strong technology relationship here that is only seems to grow over time. And yet the American neocons, the neocons that you usually can sort of consider as the neocons, the Kagans or the Crystals, are not comfortable with this growing relationship between Israel and Russia. And just sort of hearkening back, to thinking back about that key moment when Obama decided not to bomb Syria in the wake of the Ghouta false flag, but then a reporter then asked John Kerry, then head of the State Department, what could happen that would ensure that Obama doesn't bomb Syria, and Kerry quickly offered up they could get rid of Assad could get rid of all their chemical weapons, and very quickly the Russians jumped in to say we can make that happen, and then ultimately did start to help make that happen. And as I've said many times before, I, of course, am no fan of chemical weapons or nuclear weapons or any of these types of things. But in many ways, you could see that as very much the accomplishment of the clean break desire to roll back Syria, to roll back their the threat that they had with those weapons in a military fashion. So, and Russia played a key role in helping make that happen. And Russia is playing a key role in certain aspects of the Israeli security agreements in relationship to how Syria is going to be resolved, who's going to negotiate some of the border concerns, who's going to negotiate the Iran-Israel relationship in terms of Iran's growing influence and desire to be in the region there. And so that's another aspect of this that I alluded to before, that partially in a certain way of discrediting the United States, where a lot of the Muslim world has now called for the United States to take itself out as the main negotiator. In a certain way does open the door for other parties that would most likely be taken by a country like Russia.
Indeed, excellent points. I'm so glad you're bringing this up. And once again, we will definitely link to the Jeff Blankford article in our show notes. And that article, I think, is vitally important in terms of exposing the fact that there is indeed a major split, not just among even the liberal establishment and the Israeli establishment, but even between American neocons, the types that you mentioned, such as Bill Kristol and types like David Frum and Robert Kagan, who take more of a hardline stance against Russia, and these Israelis. And even in the article that Blankford posted, and this and another article that was posted in 2014 about how Israel and American neoconservatives have a different opinion on Ukraine, and particularly Israel's refusal to condemn the Russia taking back Crimea from the Ukraine. There were quotes in there from, I believe it was Danielle Pletka at the American Enterprise Institute, and also Seth Mandel of Commentary Magazine, alluding to the fact that we don't air this stuff out in public. If we have disagreements, we don't air this out publicly. Israel has a right to be wrong about certain issues, but they're still our ally, and we're not going to air this dirty laundry out in public. So if they're not airing it out in public, then it's a very good possibility that this is being aired out in private, and part of this private battle is being waged through this political war that I think has been going on since the rise of Donald Trump in this 2016 election, where I think this split, this battle, these various battles became full circle. So I'm glad you're bringing that up, and we'll have to continue to discuss this as long as the Russia issue remains a blind spot within so much of the alternative media. And now with this Russia thing, I think one of the key players who's beginning to emerge as a possible link between Donald Trump and Russia is one Erik Prince. And Erik Prince, I think, is symbolic of this conservative, like hardline shift that we're seeing here. He represents this mindset very well as he's connected with the hardline evangelical Amway family, the Amway fortune, has this very you could say Prince falls into kind of this apocalyptic vision of the world and the clash of civilizations and what things are going to look like as it relates to so-called biblical prophecy or whatnot. Erik Prince's name has been popping up as having key meetings with Russians in the lead up to the inauguration. Just came out. We read an article in Haaretz that Erik Prince had direct security deals or deal making and business ventures with was it Avi Harrow? Is that correct?
Ari
Ari
Haro.
Harrow. And
Yeah.
Ari Harrow was basically the equivalent of the role that Rahm Emanuel played in the Obama administration to Netanyahu. And Avi Harrow has been effectively taken down as a result of this corruption scandal against Netanyahu, which is flying very much under the radar in the West, but in Israel appears to be just as big of a deal as this ongoing Trump-Russia Gate scandal and the efforts to remove Trump from office that's being put out by some elements within the establishment here in the West. And so anyway, you see here with Erik Prince, you've got another direct connection to Russia and Israel here via, or between Erik Prince and Israel and Erik Prince and Russia. And it has to do a lot with efforts with cybersecurity and various military type dealings. And where I want to go with this is that Erik Prince was identified within the Breitbart and even the InfoWars community to an extent, with Alex Jones working to try and rehabilitate Erik Prince's image during the run-up to the 2016 election, particularly after the exposure of these Anthony Weiner, Huma Abedin, Anthony Weiner's laptop, which had all this damning information on the Clintons and Huma Abedin, among others. And Erik Prince was making the rounds through some of the patriot media, such as Breitbart, as being a key player in this exposing of these private emails. And it looks like in collaboration with various elements of the NYPD. Another person who popped up as being a major player in this, I think he made some cryptic statements within days of this breaking of these laptops, in conjunction with I think Comey's announcement about Clinton being under investigation for various things. Giuliani had made cryptic statements on Fox News that you're going to hear some major news in the next few days coming out of the campaign regarding Clinton and things of that nature. And so when you look at this, Giuliani has long been a major player in the New York, I'd say within the law enforcement community, going back to his days as a district prosecutor, where he effectively worked to crack down on the traditional Italian mafia and replace it with these Soviet emigres who kind of came in and took over the mob scene in New York. And then from there went on to be the mayor of New York, where he was actively involved in the September 11th cover-up in his role as mayor. And then from there, in recent years, in the lead up to this election, it appears that Giuliani served as a surrogate of sorts to Trump and to the Trump campaign in the months leading up to the election. He made various trips to Israel that were documented within the Israeli press, basically assuring Israel that Trump is a man that they can trust. And then post-election, between the election and the inauguration, Giuliani went over to Israel on behalf of his law firm that he works with. I believe it's Greenberg Traurig, and was visiting Israel, and I believe a specific role was involving issues related to cybersecurity and the U.S.-Israel relationship. So I think with this Erik Prince connection to basically Netanyahu's chief of staff, in some ways you'd call him his right-hand man, direct business ventures, and you take into consideration that, and then you look at Prince's role in the disclosure of these emails, it very much appears to be, when you take all accounts into consideration, considering the media network that was behind exposing all of this damning information on the Clintons. I think once again, we're seeing another major connection via Erik Prince and his mercenary network, and even someone like Rudy Giuliani, and the exposure of these emails and this damning information on the Clintons just days prior to the election, and Israel, particularly within the right wing in Israel.
I think so, and I think it's pretty incredible how little this connection of, well, I don't find it incredible, but it's pretty telling and damning how little this Prince connection to the right next to Netanyahu and to some of these very key Israeli billionaires, his direct potential investment relationships, how little that's been brought up in the midst of all these other revelations in terms of Prince's connections to potentially to aspects of Chinese intelligence, Prince acting as some type of back channel between aspects of the Trump campaign to aspects of Russia. But yes, meanwhile, in Haaretz, you have an article showing that he has a history. That's not that long ago. That's basically ties back to just like, when Mitt Romney was running for office, basically backed by very similar, we should say, networks in certain ways, right into to Netanyahu's already convicted chief of staff. And some of these billionaires that he was being, tied into in a financial way are people like Dorian Barak. Dorian Barak, who is I believe he's a billionaire asset manager, and it's pointed out in some descriptions of him that he is a fixture of the Israel-China trade axis. And he serves on the boards of companies active in the technology and natural resources sectors in Israel, Africa, and China. Right. And his background is very, very interesting. Also, in terms of he was high up in Bank Hapoalim, which is one of Israel's two major banks, deeply connected with its intelligence communities over the decades, but also was an attorney at a high-power law firm in New York called Skadden Arps, and also subsequently, maybe coincidentally, but or not, a consultant with the Boston Consulting Group, i.e., someone like Netanyahu or Romney. And where was he? Where was he educated? Yale University, Oxford University, and UCLA. Okay, so this is one person that Prince was tied into, but another was the Iranian born billionaire Vincent Cengiz, who's tied in very closely to the origins of the background of Cambridge Analytica and its parent company, the Strategic Communications Laboratories Group, which also had an institute called the Behavioral Dynamics Institute, i.e., military intelligence, psychological warfare based around civilian targets, election targets, these types of things. And as I've mentioned before, I believe, Cengiz also is the first known or publicly recognized employer of Black Cube, the same Israeli intelligence-based sort of corporate intelligence contractor that it was disclosed that Harvey Weinstein used along with Kroll Incorporated to try to get dirt, to try to intimidate his victims of sexual predation. So this is not just some random set here. This is very much shows the network that someone like Erik Prince exists in. And then just final point in terms of looking at Prince's actual material interests, investments, besides just sort of like either writing him off as, the Blackwater war criminal, which he is, or as the sort of reclaimed, rehabilitated patriot, the misunderstood patriot of the Alex Jones crew, especially in the run-up to the election in terms of actions about disclosures of Hillary Clinton's emails in conjunction with the NYPD. I just want to point out, too, that his Frontier Holding Group, or Frontier Services Group, that he's the head of, is very much a conjunction of Chinese interests, and African interests, and then Israeli interests. And so people should go look at that. But yes, I think we should get back into the what did Prince actually do as an operative on the ground in America in the lead up to the election. And he was very much tied into to these groups of people like Rudy Giuliani, Michael Mukasey, Alex Jones. Isn't it interesting that Alex Jones, as Trump came up, Alex Jones took on a former Blackwater security guard and started getting closer and making apologies for someone like Erik Prince. And of course, none of this should ever be taken as if somehow we are apologizers for Hillary, or that we wanted Hillary Clinton what did we want? Hillary Clinton in the White House? No, we did not.
We wanted Hillary elected. We wanted Hitler reelected.
At the same time, we need to look at, we have someone like Steve Pieczenik on the public record in the run up to some of the election and some of these major moves that involved the FBI making announcements at the time, that this was a coup or a counter coup by patriots in many ways. And, whether there is a larger structure, or there are players that are deeper behind the scenes that are more patriotic than what it looks like people like Rudy Giuliani or Erik Prince or Michael Mukasey could ever believe to be believed to be, is not, we don't know exactly, but the exact, work of these kind of people on the ground in terms of the framing of the election needs to be looked at once again in relationship to the timing and, of course, their material interests. Rudy Giuliani was not only has this background that you very clearly laid out in terms of his role in the New York area, but then also he is also been involved in some of these similar networks that Flynn was, that are related to aspects of Turkish intelligence, Turkish industrialists, and helping to run cover for them in the American court system too.
Yeah, indeed. And I don't think it's any accident. I just want to mention this connection that we've established between, I believe it was Barack and Cambridge Analytica and the parent group. And it's no accident, I don't think, that Cambridge Analytica, which pretty much, I think, serves as an operation, as an outlet to play psychological warfare in some ways with the voter base, particularly the conservative voting base here in the West, and getting a feel on how conservative voters are feeling and manipulating their feelings into elections, into voting for certain people and for certain policies, that it's no accident that this popped up in 2013, which was the aftermath of Obama's re-election against Mitt Romney, who, while Romney clearly, I guess, is not in line with much of the MAGA stance, as indicated by a lot of what he said, and he was very much seen as friendlier to the hardliners in Israel than someone like Obama was. And it's no accident, I think, that we've had that Cambridge Analytica rises up with the rest of this media, this new right media, which has become really pronounced within the years since 2012, particularly in the lead up to the 2016 election. And it just happens to be a man who's on the board of Cambridge Analytica, Steve Bannon, directly funded, his media outlet directly funded by Robert Mercer, who is a major player in Cambridge Analytica, and his daughter Rebecca, that these people become the head of the administration. They become the mouthpiece for people like Erik Prince to put out to talk about and put out all this damning info that's coming out against the Clinton family. It's no accident, and it needs to be analyzed, and we will continue to analyze it. And we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, but this segues into this whole idea that there's this that everything involving Trump is a multi-dimensional chess game. I think even the term 3D chess has become sort of a household word within the kind of the Trump movement, within the alternative media. The idea that everything Trump's doing is just this genius chess move. And one of the aspects that's talked about, that we're starting to hear more about, is this idea that, and really I should say it's everything from a policy or an announcement that Trump will make that seems to be friendly to certain interests that are not with the whole Make America Great Again crowd. And you highlight, for example, when Trump would not move the embassy to Jerusalem, it was, oh, well, he's sticking it to Israel. But then when he does move the embassy, aha, it's a genius chess move. It's designed to turn global opinion against Israel by exposing the true face of Zionism. So you get these kind of extremes. And so you get this narrative to where one thing that Trump does can be construed as good, and then when he actually does the opposite of it, oh, well, it's still, still there's a complicated reason behind this. And it involves this 4D chess theory, and I'm open to some aspects of it. We've talked about the possibility of there being a third network at play, perhaps, that is outside of this these competing factions that we've identified, perhaps being a genuine patriot network somewhere that is perhaps putting out some of these is exposing some of the criminality of these major figures within the establishment, things such as abuse, sexual abuse, and sexual misconduct, and things of that nature. And we've identified it. I think the problem is with this narrative, and I think that the idea that the intelligence agencies are going to be rehashed, that there's going to be this perhaps potential counter coup in the future led by people like Mike Pompeo and Erik Prince and even Oliver North have been discussed as being potential players in this effort to try and maybe rid the intelligence agencies of some of the deep state machinators. But it fits into this narrative. But my problem with this 4D chess thing is that when you don't take these facts that we've laid out and others have laid out into consideration, that these explanations don't make any sense when you leave out important facts about who people like Erik Prince and Rudy Giuliani are and what they represent and all these other individuals, and trying to somehow play a 4D chess theory that an outlet such as Breitbart or some of these other hard right-wing outlets and individuals are somehow actually not loyal to Israel. They don't have any type of love for Israel. They're just saying what they need to say to get ahead, and then they're really going to stick it to the Zionists when they get in there, and they're actually not working for what they perceive as Israel's best interest, the interest of the Likud. I think this is a problem when you just throw out these chess theories and don't take so many of these considerations into you don't actually expose these connections and take into consideration what they mean. I think it becomes a problem. And we might have to discuss this chess theory thing more in the future, but what do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces of this this idea of the 3D chess, or the sort of faith-based politics, or this is all a positive sleeper conspiracy going on behind the scenes, and we should just trust in the God Emperor Trump and just sort of sit and get ready for all the secret black technology to be released and these types of things. And I'll admit, like, I have lots of hopes that are tied into intellectual processes that I've gone through over 10 years of studying and doing activism around September 11th. About it's impossible for me to conceptualize that you would have a government that is based on the public officials, including the military and intelligence officials, taking oaths not to a certain leadership but to a constitutional principle that deeply and intensely implies rule of law, that would not somehow respond even if it took a long time and was very difficult, and there was ups and downs, to something as brash and blatantly treasonous as September 11th, as a domestic black operation in the United States of America, and especially one that's so obviously tied into a very specific desires and power-based foreign policies of a foreign military power of Israel. So there are those aspects that are still in the back of my mind, that I'm like, that, yeah, I could see that there's also evidence that all along the way certain things were pushed back against, whether it's September 11th not going down exactly as it might have been meant to, whether it's the fourth target represented by the Flight 93 not striking where it was meant to, or whether it's the Mossad white vans in going to bridges and tunnels connecting New York to New Jersey being intercepted that could have made the operation even worse. These types of things hint that it's not just a monolithic conspiracy that's all powerful in play here. And at the same time, things such that are so blatant, such as, for example, Alex Jones and InfoWars, and how he begin to make it very clear in the run-up to the election, but most intensely after the election, in the transition period, that he was linking the fate and the destiny of the Make America Great MAGA a code of ethics to the survival of the Netanyahu administration in Israel was very blatantly there. We've talked about moral compromise, but there's also intellectual compromise that's intimated at in relationship to this Trump movement, where you have people who supposedly have called themselves the father of the 9/11 truth movement and have done the most to spread the truth about September 11th and the false flags. I'm the one who put that out there. You know, you're a mentally diseased idiot to talk about all of the people on the ground surrounding Trump that are tied into what actually happened when thousands of people were killed in Lower Manhattan on September 11th. And somehow Alex Jones has to push all of those actual facts of the matter outside to somehow link not only the MAGA agenda, but also his show more and more in terms of Jerome Corsi getting texts from high-level Israeli intelligence on air.
You had Aaron Klein on to push the lines on Iran and Jerusalem and all that too. So Breitbart Jerusalem head.
So there's that aspect, and that obviously that needs to be called out. That's just blatant. That's the type of thing is like when Obama's first year, when Obama decided to do the surge in Afghanistan, there were those of us who called him on it. I called into C-SPAN and said, yeah, okay, Obama's made his treason commitment at this point.
Yeah.
He's decided to protect, the enemies that actually attacked us on September 11th. So Trump did the exact same thing when he made his Afghanistan announcement. And if someone like Alex Jones were playing some type of patriotic 3D chess strategic long game, what he would have to do, he would have to say, I understand it's a difficult decision that you're making, but in all evidence, that is a treasonous announcement, the President
Instead,
Trump.
their solution is to blame the globalists in the administration. Trump didn't have any role, but blame the globalists. And then, on top of that, actually portray the alternative as putting private security in charge of Afghanistan, letting them do whatever they want, which is what people like Erik Prince have identified. Do you have any final thoughts before we sign off here?
Yeah, in our last minute here, then I would also point out that there are aspects of this that remind me of what was going on when the Obama administration came in, especially in the realms of maybe this sort of the more new age or people who are interested in the very real topic of things like black technology, potential extraterrestrial beings and species, the secret space program, that type of thing. When Obama came in, there was a lot of chatter that Obama was a light worker. I heard that even in like the local community co-op here in Lawrence, Kansas. Don't worry. He's like, yes, okay. I was like, he's continuing the drone strikes. He's killing innocent people. He's like, don't worry. He's a light worker. And so you're hearing same things. Don't worry. Trump may be killing lots of people, but he's the MAGA emperor. So no, let's have reasonable, moral, rational sanity and intellectual integrity, and let's start there in figuring out what's going on behind the scenes. So for the antidote, thank you so much, Greg, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks for your prescient analysis on all these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Bye-bye.